Introduction. Singapore stands as one of the most expensive cities in the world. Year after year, global cost of living surveys place this small island nation at or near the top of the rankings. For residents and observers alike, the question persists: why does living in Singapore cost so much? The answer is not simple. It cannot be reduced to a single policy decision or economic factor. Instead, the high cost of living in Singapore emerges from a complex web of geographic constraints, deliberate government policies, global economic forces, and historical circumstances that have shaped the nation over decades. This examination explores the structural and economic reasons behind Singapore's high cost of living. It looks beyond surface explanations to understand the deeper mechanisms at work in housing markets, transportation systems, taxation structures, and labor economics. The goal is not to judge whether these costs are justified, but to understand why they exist and how they interconnect. Singapore's story is one of transformation. In just over half a century, it evolved from a trading port with limited resources into a global financial center and one of the wealthiest nations per capita. This rapid development came with trade-offs, and the cost of living represents one of the most visible consequences of the choices made along the way. Section 1. Geographic and resource constraints. Singapore's high costs begin with fundamental geographic realities. The nation consists of a main island and several smaller islands, covering approximately 730 square kilometers. This makes it one of the smallest countries in the world by land area. Land scarcity defines nearly every aspect of Singaporean economics. Unlike nations that can expand outward or develop new regions, Singapore operates within fixed boundaries. Every square meter of land must serve multiple purposes and generate maximum value. This constraint creates intense competition for space, driving up costs across all sectors. The nation possesses virtually no natural resources. It has no oil, no minerals, no forest to harvest, and no agricultural capacity at scale. Even fresh water must be imported or produced through desalination and recycling. This complete dependence on external resources means that Singapore must import nearly everything its population consumes. The absence of a natural hinterland compounds these challenges. Most cities exist within larger national contexts that provide agricultural products, raw materials, and labor pools. Singapore has no such buffer. It must source everything from international markets, adding transportation costs and supply chain complexity to every good and service. The strategic location that made Singapore valuable as a trading port also exposes it to regional economic competition. The nation sits at the crossroads of major shipping lanes, but so do other Southeast Asian ports. To maintain its position, Singapore must continually invest in infrastructure and efficiency, costs that ultimately flow through to residents and businesses. Population density intensifies these geographic constraints. With over 5.5 million people living in such limited space, Singapore ranks among the most densely populated places on Earth. This density requires sophisticated infrastructure, extensive public services, and careful urban planning, all of which carry substantial costs. The tropical climate adds another layer of expense. Year-round heat and humidity necessitate constant air conditioning in homes, offices, and public spaces. This drives up electricity consumption and infrastructure requirements. Buildings must be designed and maintained to withstand intense sun, heavy rainfall, and high humidity, increasing construction and maintenance costs. These geographic and resource constraints are not temporary conditions that might improve with time or technology. They are permanent features of Singapore's existence. Every economic policy, every development decision, and every cost structure must account for these fundamental limitations. Section 2. The Housing System and Land Policy. Housing represents the single largest expense for most Singapore residents, and understanding housing costs requires understanding the government's approach to land ownership and development. The Singapore government owns approximately 90% of all land in the country. This near-total state ownership emerged from aggressive land acquisition policies implemented in the decades following independence. The government used its powers to purchase private land, often at below market rates, to gain control over development and planning. This land ownership model gives the government extraordinary power over housing supply and pricing. Rather than allowing a free market in land, the state acts as the primary landlord, developer, and regulator simultaneously. This concentration of control shapes every aspect of the housing market. The Housing and Development Board, known as HDB, manages public housing for the majority of Singaporeans. Approximately 80% of the population lives in HDB flats. These are not social housing in the traditional sense. They are sold to citizens on 99-year leases, creating a unique form of property ownership. The 99-year lease structure means that HDB flat owners do not own their property in perpetuity. They own the right to occupy and use the property for a fixed period. As the lease approaches its end, the property's value theoretically declines to zero. This creates a form of depreciating asset that differs fundamentally from freehold property ownership common in other countries. HDB flat prices are set by the government based on various factors, including location, size, and remaining lease duration. The government maintains that these prices are subsidized and affordable. However, the actual subsidy amount remains opaque, as the government does not disclose the true cost of land in its pricing calculations. For private housing, which serves the remaining 20% of the population, prices are among the highest in the world. Private property can be either leasehold or freehold, but both types command premium prices due to limited supply. The government tightly controls the release of land for private development, maintaining scarcity to preserve property values. Several policies inflate housing costs further. The additional buyer's stamp duty imposes heavy taxes on second properties and foreign purchases, sometimes exceeding 60% of the purchase price. While intended to cool the market and prioritize citizens, these taxes also signal that property is a scarce, valuable asset worth protecting through fiscal barriers. The Central Provident Fund system links housing to retirement savings. Singaporeans can use their CPF savings to purchase HDB flats, effectively converting retirement funds into housing assets. This policy increases demand for housing and allows prices to rise to levels that would be unaffordable through cash purchases alone. The government's dual role as landowner and housing provider creates inherent conflicts of interest. High land and housing prices generate substantial revenue for the government through land sales and stamp duties. This revenue funds public services and infrastructure, creating a fiscal dependence on maintaining high property values. Urban planning policies prioritize density and efficiency over space. Apartments are smaller on average than in many other developed nations. A typical 3-room HDB flat might measure 60 to 70 square meters, housing a family of 4 or more. This space constraint is reflected in pricing, where even modest accommodations command significant sums. The resale market for HDB flats operates under numerous restrictions. Owners must meet minimum occupation periods before selling. Income ceilings limit who can purchase resale flats. Ethnic quotas regulate the racial composition of housing blocks. These restrictions, while serving social policy goals, reduce market liquidity and can trap owners in properties that no longer suit their needs. Section 3, Transportation Costs and Vehicle Ownership. Transportation in Singapore operates under one of the world's most restrictive and expensive vehicle ownership systems. This system deliberately makes car ownership prohibitively costly for most residents, shaping urban mobility and contributing significantly to the high cost of living for those who choose or need to own vehicles. The Certificate of Entitlement, or COE, represents the most visible cost barrier. Before anyone can register a vehicle in Singapore, they must first bid for and win a COE in a monthly auction. These certificates grant the right to own and operate a vehicle for 10 years. COE prices fluctuate based on demand, but they routinely exceed 50,000 Singapore dollars and have reached over $100,000 for larger vehicles. The COE system caps the total vehicle population, preventing road congestion in a land-scarce nation. However, it also creates a two-tier system where vehicle ownership becomes a luxury good accessible primarily to the wealthy. The cost of the COE alone often exceeds the price of the vehicle itself in other countries. Beyond the COE, vehicle buyers face additional registration fees that can equal or exceed the open market value of the car. The additional registration fee, or ARF, charges up to 180% of the vehicle's value as a one-time tax. This means that a car with an open market value of $50,000 might cost $140,000 in RF alone before adding the COE and the base vehicle price. Import duties, goods and services tax, and various administrative fees add further costs. By the time all fees and taxes are included, a modest family car that might cost $25,000 in the United States or Europe can easily cost $150,000 or more in Singapore. Ongoing vehicle costs compound these initial expenses. Road tax, insurance, parking fees, and electronic road pricing charges for using certain roads during peak hours all add to the monthly cost of vehicle ownership. Fuel prices, while not exceptionally high by global standards, contribute to the overall expense. Public transportation, while extensive and efficient, carries its own costs. The mass rapid transit system and bus network cover most of the island, but fares are not subsidized to the extent seen in some other cities. Commuters pay distance-based fares that can add up for those living far from their workplaces. For families, the transportation calculation becomes complex. A household might save money by avoiding car ownership and using public transport. But this comes with trade-offs in convenience, time, and flexibility. Families with young children, elderly relatives, or those working irregular hours often find public transport insufficient for their needs. Yet car ownership remains financially daunting. The transportation system reflects a broader pattern in Singapore's approach to managing scarcity. Rather than expanding supply, which is impossible given land constraints, the government uses price mechanisms to restrict demand. This approach is economically rational, but places the burden of adjustment on individuals and families. Section 4, the cost of goods and services. Beyond housing and transportation, everyday goods and services in Singapore carry premium prices compared to many other developed nations. Multiple factors contribute to these elevated costs, from import dependence to labor policies to market structure. Singapore imports virtually all consumer goods. The nation has no significant manufacturing sector for consumer products, no agriculture beyond small-scale urban farming, and no natural resources to process. Everything from food to clothing to electronics arrives from overseas. Import dependence means that global supply chain costs directly impact local prices. Shipping, handling, warehousing, and distribution all add margins to product costs. Even goods manufactured in nearby countries must pass through Singapore's ports and logistics networks, accumulating costs at each stage. The small market size prevents economies of scale. With a population of just over 5 million, Singapore cannot support the kind of high-volume, low-margin retail operations common in larger markets. Retailers must charge higher margins to cover fixed costs like rent, labor, and inventory across a smaller customer base. Retail space costs reflect the broader land scarcity issue. Prime shopping districts command some of the world's highest retail rents. These costs pass directly to consumers through higher prices. Even in suburban areas, retail space is expensive relative to other countries, as all land in Singapore is scarce and valuable. The goods and services tax, currently at 9%, adds to the cost of most purchases. While not exceptionally high compared to value-added taxes in European countries, it represents a visible addition to prices. The government has indicated intentions to raise this rate further in coming years to fund aging-related expenditures. Labor costs for service industries have risen significantly in recent years. Policies restricting foreign worker inflows and mandating higher wages for low-income workers have increased operating costs for restaurants, retail shops, and service businesses. These costs translate into higher prices for consumers. Food costs deserve particular attention as they represent a significant portion of household budgets. Singapore imports over 90% of its food. This dependence on imports makes food prices vulnerable to global commodity fluctuations, currency movements, and supply chain disruptions. Dining out, a central part of Singaporean culture, has become increasingly expensive. While hawker centers still offer relatively affordable meals, restaurant prices have climbed steadily. Rent, labor costs, and ingredient prices all contribute to rising food service costs. Alcohol and tobacco face especially heavy taxation. The government imposes high duties on these products for both revenue generation and public health objectives. A beer or glass of wine in Singapore can cost several times what it would in producing countries. Healthcare, while heavily subsidized for citizens, still requires significant out-of-pocket spending. The system relies on a combination of government subsidies, mandatory health savings accounts, and private insurance. For complex treatments or private health care, costs can be substantial. Education expenses, particularly for private or international schools, rank among the world's highest. While public education is relatively affordable for citizens, many expatriate families and some local families opt for private education, which can cost tens of thousands of dollars annually per child. Child care and domestic help, essential services for many working families, carry significant costs. Foreign domestic workers, while more affordable than in many Western countries, still represent a substantial monthly expense when salary, levies, insurance, and accommodation are included. Section 5. The labor market and wage structures. Understanding why living in Singapore costs so much requires examining not just prices but also incomes. The labor market in Singapore operates under unique conditions that shape both earning potential and cost structures. Singapore positions itself as a global talent hub, attracting skilled workers from around the world. This strategy creates a highly competitive labor market where wages for certain professions reach international levels. Finance, technology, legal services, and senior management positions often command salaries comparable to or exceeding those in other global cities. However, wage distribution in Singapore shows significant inequality. While top earners receive substantial compensation, median wages remain moderate relative to living costs. The gap between high earners and median workers is wider than in many other developed economies. The foreign worker policy creates a segmented labor market. At the top end, employment pass holders in professional roles earn high salaries and enjoy various benefits. At the lower end, work permit holders in construction, domestic work, and service industry earn significantly less, often just enough to meet basic needs. The Central Provident Fund system affects take-home pay and employment costs. Employees contribute 20% of their salary to CPF, while employers contribute 17%. This mandatory savings system reduces disposable income while increasing the total cost of employment for businesses. CPF contributions serve multiple purposes: retirement savings, healthcare funding, and housing finance. While this creates forced savings, it also means that workers have less cash available for daily expenses. The system assumes that CPF savings will eventually be accessed for housing and retirement, but in the meantime, it constrains spending power. Wage growth has not kept pace with cost increases in key areas like housing. While nominal wages have risen over the years, real wage growth adjusted for the cost of major expenses like housing has been more modest. This creates a squeeze where incomes rise, but purchasing power for essential goods and services does not improve proportionally. The absence of a minimum wage for most of the period under examination meant that low-wage workers faced particular challenges. Recent introduction of a progressive wage model in certain sectors aims to address this, but coverage remains limited. Many workers in service industries, retail, and other sectors still earn wages that barely cover basic living costs in Singapore. Career progression and wage growth often require job changes rather than internal promotion. The labor market rewards mobility, but this creates uncertainty and requires workers to continuously prove their value. Long-term employment with steady wage growth is less common than in some other developed economies. The cost of living affects wage negotiations and expectations. Employers must offer salaries that allow workers to afford Singapore's high costs, particularly housing. This creates upward pressure on wages, which in turn increases business costs and contributes to higher prices for goods and services. For expatriate workers, compensation packages often include housing allowances, education allowances, and other benefits that local workers do not receive. This two-tier system reflects the reality that attracting foreign talent requires offsetting Singapore's high costs, but it also creates disparities and resentment. Section 6. Taxation and Government Revenue. Singapore's taxation system differs markedly from most developed nations, and understanding this system is essential to understanding the overall cost structure. The government generates revenue through methods that may not appear as traditional taxes, but nonetheless extract value from residents and businesses. Personal income tax rates in Singapore are relatively low by international standards. The top marginal rate reaches 22%, significantly lower than in many European countries or even the United States. This low-income tax regime is often cited as evidence that Singapore is a low-tax jurisdiction. However, this characterization misses crucial elements of how the government funds itself. The state generates substantial revenue through land sales, vehicle-related fees, stamp duties, and other mechanisms that function as taxes, even if not labeled as such. Land sales represent a major revenue source. When the government releases land for development, it auctions sites to developers who pay substantial sums for the right to build. These costs ultimately flow through to property buyers and renters. In effect, residents pay for government services through higher housing costs rather than through income taxes. The Certificate of Entitlement system for vehicles functions as a consumption tax on car ownership. The government collects billions of dollars annually through COE auctions, additional registration fees, and road taxes. These revenues fund transportation infrastructure and other public services. Stamp duties on property transactions generate significant income. Buyer stamp duty, additional buyer stamp duty, and seller's stamp duty can collectively amount to substantial percentages of property values. These taxes are paid by individuals but collected by the government as revenue. The goods and services tax applies broadly to consumption, generating steady revenue. At 9% and rising, this tax affects all residents regardless of income level. It is regressive in nature, taking a larger proportional bite from lower-income households that spend most of their income on taxable goods and services. Corporate tax rates are low at 17%, part of Singapore's strategy to attract multinational corporations and regional headquarters. However, this means that the government must generate revenue from other sources, shifting the burden toward individuals through property-related charges and consumption taxes. The Central Provident Fund system, while technically not a tax, functions similarly in some respects. Mandatory contributions reduce take-home pay and limit consumption. The government invests CPF funds and pays interest to members, but the returns are typically below what the government earns on these investments, creating an implicit revenue stream. The absence of capital gains tax and estate tax benefits wealthy individuals and encourages capital accumulation. However, it also means the government foregoes potential revenue from these sources, requiring higher revenues from other mechanisms that may disproportionately affect middle-income residents. Government-linked companies operate across many sectors of the economy, from telecommunications to transportation to real estate. These entities generate profits that flow to government investment vehicles. While operating as commercial entities, their dominant market positions and government backing create revenue streams that indirectly fund state activities. The overall tax structure is regressive when all revenue mechanisms are considered. While income taxes are progressive, the heavy reliance on property-related charges, vehicle fees, and consumption taxes means that middle-income households pay a higher proportion of their income toward government revenue than the headline income tax rates suggest. This revenue model creates a fiscal dependence on high asset prices. The government needs expensive land, expensive vehicles, and expensive property transactions to generate the revenue required for public services. This creates an incentive to maintain high costs in these areas, even as it makes life more expensive for residents. Section 7. Global Economic Integration and Foreign Investment. Singapore's integration into the global economy shapes its cost structure in profound ways. The nation's strategy of attracting foreign capital and multinational corporations brings benefits, but also contributes to high living costs. Singapore positions itself as a stable, business-friendly hub for international companies. Low corporate taxes, strong rule of law, efficient bureaucracy, and strategic location make it attractive for regional headquarters and operations. Thousands of multinational corporations maintain significant presence in Singapore. This foreign investment brings high-paying jobs and economic activity. However, it also creates demand for premium office space, luxury housing, and high-end services. The presence of well-compensated expatriates and wealthy foreign residents pushes up prices in restaurants, retail, and entertainment. The financial services sector exemplifies this dynamic. Singapore has developed into a major financial center, competing with Hong Kong, Tokyo, and Sydney. Banks, asset managers, and financial institutions employ thousands of highly paid professionals. These workers can afford premium prices, and businesses adjust their pricing accordingly. Wealth management has become a significant industry. Singapore attracts wealthy individuals from across Asia and beyond, drawn by political stability, banking secrecy laws, and favorable tax treatment. This concentration of wealth creates demand for luxury goods, premium real estate, and exclusive services, pulling prices upward. The property market particularly reflects foreign investment influence. While restrictions limit foreign ownership of certain property types, foreigners can purchase private condominiums and landed property with approval. Foreign demand for Singapore property, driven by the nation's stability and growth prospects, supports high valuations. Currency strength affects import costs and purchasing power. The Singapore dollar has generally been strong and stable, which helps moderate import costs. However, this strength also makes Singapore expensive for foreign visitors and can affect export competitiveness, requiring businesses to focus on high-value activities that can justify premium pricing. Regional economic dynamics play a role. Singapore competes with and complements other Southeast Asian economies. It positions itself as the premium option, offering superior infrastructure, governance, and services. This positioning requires maintaining high standards, which carries costs that translate into higher prices. The global talent market influences wage structures. To attract skilled professionals from around the world, Singapore employers must offer competitive compensation. This is particularly true in sectors like technology, finance, and professional services, where talent is mobile and in demand globally. Trade dependence creates vulnerability to global price fluctuations. When commodity prices rise, food and energy costs in Singapore increase quickly. When supply chains face disruptions, Singapore feels the impact through higher prices and reduced availability. The nation has limited ability to buffer itself from global economic shocks. Foreign investment in real estate, while regulated, still affects market dynamics. Even when foreigners cannot directly purchase certain properties, their presence in the market for luxury properties affects overall price levels and creates demonstration effects that influence local buyers' expectations. Section 8. Historical Development and Path Dependence. Singapore's current cost structure cannot be understood without examining the historical choices and circumstances that shaped its development. Decisions made decades ago created path dependencies that continue to influence costs today. At independence in 1965, Singapore faced existential challenges. Separated from Malaysia, lacking natural resources, and surrounded by larger neighbors, the young nation needed to establish economic viability quickly. The government adopted strategies focused on rapid industrialization, foreign investment attraction, and social stability. The decision to pursue export-oriented industrialization required infrastructure investment and a disciplined workforce. The government invested heavily in ports, airports, and industrial facilities. These investments were financed partly through revenue from land sales and development, establishing a pattern of funding public goods through property-related income. The Housing and Development Board's massive building program addressed a housing crisis, but also established government dominance in the property market. By the 1980s, the majority of Singaporeans lived in HDB flats, creating a population with vested interests in property values and government housing policies. The Central Provident Fund system, introduced in 1955 and expanded over decades, created a social compact where citizens accepted lower take-home pay in exchange for forced savings and eventual property ownership. This system reduced the need for a comprehensive welfare state, but also locked citizens into a model where wealth accumulation depends heavily on property. Economic restructuring in the 1980s and 1990s shifted Singapore towards services and high-value manufacturing. This transition required attracting skilled workers and multinational corporations, leading to policies that made Singapore expensive, but also more productive and wealthy. The decision to maintain tight control over land use and vehicle ownership reflected early recognition of space constraints. Rather than allowing sprawl or congestion, the government chose to manage scarcity through pricing and regulation. These policies, once established, became difficult to reverse as they generated revenue and shaped urban form. Financial sector development accelerated in the 1990s and 2000s, transforming Singapore into a major financial center. This brought wealth and high-paying jobs, but also increased inequality and created a two-tier economy where finance professionals earned multiples of median wages. The Asian financial crisis of 1997 and the global financial crisis of 2008 reinforced Singapore's focus on stability and prudent fiscal management. The government's conservative approach to public finances, while creating resilience, also meant continued reliance on revenue from land sales and property-related charges. Population policies evolved over time, from encouraging births in the 1960s and 1970s to accepting lower birth rates and increasing immigration in recent decades. The influx of foreign workers and residents, while economically necessary, created social tensions and contributed to demand pressures on housing and infrastructure. Each policy decision created constituencies and expectations that made reversal difficult. HDB flat owners expect their property values to be protected. Businesses depend on access to foreign labor. The government relies on land sales and property taxes for revenue. These interconnected dependencies create inertia that perpetuates high costs. The success of Singapore's development model, measured by GDP growth and rising living standards, validated the approaches taken. However, this success came with trade-offs, and the high cost of living represents one of the most significant. The question facing Singapore is whether the model that brought prosperity can be adjusted to address affordability without undermining the foundations of that prosperity. Section 9. Comparative Context and Global Rankings. Singapore's position in global cost of living rankings provides context for understanding its expense relative to other cities. Year after year, surveys by organizations like the Economist Intelligence Unit place Singapore at or near the top of the world's most expensive cities. These rankings typically measure the cost of a basket of goods and services, including housing, transportation, food, clothing, and entertainment. Singapore consistently scores high across multiple categories, not just in one or two areas. This broad-based expense distinguishes it from cities that might be expensive in housing but affordable in other respects. Comparing Singapore to other expensive cities reveals both similarities and differences.
Cities like Zurich, Geneva, and Oslo also rank among the most expensive, but they exist in countries with high wages, strong social safety nets, and different economic structures. Singapore's expense occurs in a context of lower income taxes, but higher out-of-pocket costs for many services.
Hong Kong presents perhaps the most relevant comparison. Like Singapore, it is a small, densely populated Asian financial center with limited land and high property prices. Both cities face similar constraints and have adopted some similar policies. However, differences in governance, taxation, and social policy create distinct cost structures. New York, London, and Tokyo represent other relevant comparisons as global cities with high costs. Each has its own drivers of expense, from rent control distortions in New York to planning restrictions in London to cultural factors in Tokyo. Singapore's expense is distinctive in how much stems from deliberate government policy rather than market forces alone. The cost of living must be considered alongside income levels. Singapore has high GDP per capita and many residents earn substantial incomes. For high earners, Singapore's costs are manageable and offset by low income taxes. For median earners, the picture is more challenging, with housing costs consuming large portions of income. Purchasing power parity adjustments attempt to account for these differences, measuring what incomes can actually buy in different locations. By these measures, Singapore's high costs are somewhat offset by high incomes, but significant affordability challenges remain for middle and lower income residents. Quality of life factors complicate simple cost comparisons. Singapore offers excellent public safety, clean environment, efficient infrastructure, and political stability. These attributes have value that pure cost comparisons do not capture. Residents may accept higher costs in exchange for these benefits. The composition of costs matters as much as the total. Singapore's expense is heavily weighted toward housing and transportation, with food and other goods more moderate. This creates a situation where basic living is expensive, but discretionary spending can be relatively affordable. Regional comparisons highlight Singapore's premium. Neighboring countries like Malaysia and Thailand offer much lower costs of living, though with different governance, infrastructure, and economic opportunities. This proximity creates arbitrage opportunities, with some Singaporeans living across borders or shopping in neighboring countries. The trajectory of costs over time shows steady increases, particularly in housing. While some categories have seen prices moderate or even decline due to competition and technology, the major cost drivers of housing and transportation have consistently risen faster than general inflation. Conclusion: the interconnected system.
The high cost of living in Singapore emerges from an interconnected system of geographic constraints, policy choices, economic strategies, and historical path dependencies. No single factor explains the expense. Instead, multiple elements reinforce each other, creating a structure where high costs are both cause and consequence of the nation's development model.
Land scarcity underlies nearly every cost pressure. With limited space and no possibility of territorial expansion, Singapore must extract maximum value from every square meter. This drives up property prices, which in turn affect business costs, which flow through to consumer prices. Government policies deliberately maintain high costs in certain areas, particularly vehicle ownership and property. These policies serve multiple purposes: managing demand for scarce resources, generating government revenue, and shaping social behavior. However, they also make life expensive for residents. The economic strategy of attracting foreign investment and positioning Singapore as a premium hub requires maintaining high standards in infrastructure, governance, and services. These standards carry costs that must be funded somehow, and the funding mechanisms chosen by the government often involve charges that affect residents' cost of living. The labor market reflects global competition for talent, requiring high wages for skilled workers while also relying on lower-wage foreign workers for many services. This creates inequality in a segmented economy where costs vary dramatically depending on which segment one occupies. The taxation system, while featuring low income tax rates, extracts revenue through property-related charges, vehicle fees, and consumption taxes. This approach makes Singapore attractive for high earners, but creates affordability challenges for middle-income residents who face high costs without proportionally high incomes. Historical decisions created path dependencies that are difficult to reverse. The CPF system, HDB housing model, and land ownership structure all emerged from specific historical circumstances, but now form the foundation of Singapore's social and economic system. Changing these fundamentals would require rethinking the entire model. The success of Singapore's development, measured by economic growth and rising prosperity, validates many of the choices made. However, this success has not eliminated the challenge of affordability. As costs have risen, questions emerge about sustainability and whether future generations will find Singapore accessible. The high cost of living in Singapore is not an accident or a failure of policy. It is, in many ways, the intended outcome of deliberate choices made to manage scarcity, attract investment, and fund public services without high income taxes. Understanding this helps explain why costs remain high despite awareness of the challenges they create. For residents, the cost of living represents a daily reality that shapes decisions about housing, transportation, family planning, and career choices. For policymakers, it presents ongoing challenges in balancing economic objectives with social goals. For observers, it offers lessons about the trade-offs inherent in urban development and economic strategy. Singapore's experience demonstrates that prosperity and affordability are not the same thing. A nation can be wealthy by aggregate measures, while individuals struggle with high costs. It shows how geographic constraints shape economic possibilities, and how policy choices made decades ago continue to influence present realities. The question of whether Singapore's high costs are sustainable or desirable cannot be answered definitively. It depends on one's perspective, income level, and values. What is clear is that the costs emerge from deep structural factors that cannot be easily changed without fundamentally altering the nation's economic and social model. Understanding why living in Singapore costs so much requires looking beyond simple explanations to see the complex system of constraints, choices, and consequences that have shaped this unique city-state. The expense is not arbitrary. It reflects the reality of building a prosperous nation on a small island with no natural resources, using strategies that prioritize stability, efficiency, and global competitiveness, even when those strategies make daily life expensive for residents.